Okay, everybody, so welcome. This session is sponsored by the Blue Center of Global Strategic Assessment at Yale University. This center, the Blue Center, its mission is to make Yale a leading center for the study of security, statecraft, and international strategy. Among its main focus of the center, it's to reach academics and practice, and that's exactly what this session is trying to do. The session topic is about trade and industrial policy in a changing geopolitical environment. So with no further ado, let me give you the chair of the session, Jim Grossman.
Great. So I have four excellent panelists who are going to do most of the heavy lifting. I'm going to be very brief in introducing them and a little bit longer in introducing the topic to you. From closest to farthest, Arnaud Costaneau, Ford Professor of Economics at MIT, Ralph Ossa, the UBS Foundation Professor at the University of Zurich, and until recently the Chief Economist at the World Trade Organization, Andres Rodriguez-Clare, the Edward G. and Nancy S. Jordan Professor of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and Lorenzo Caliendo, the Won Park Han Professor of Global Affairs and Management at Yale University. I would give you some of their background, but we don't have time for that, but take my word for it, you got a lot of expertise on trade and industrial policy up here. So let me set the stage for the discussion and lay out some of the questions that are on my mind, and maybe my fellow panelists will answer them. If not, I'll tell you the right answers at the end. I have a good list of questions. They only have 8 minutes each, so they won't be able to address all the questions. They've prepared some remarks that sort of speak around my questions. So the starting point is that there seems to be a new understanding, not only among policymakers, but even among trade economists, that what we thought about, what are the gains from trade, what risk trade poses that we've been missing, and what is the role for trade and industrial policy in this new world. All of this has been changing. I think the new thinking is captured well in an opinion piece that was published in Finance and Development by Kim Rule, who some of you will know was the trade expert on the President Trump's Council of Economic Advisors, and I think it's useful to quote from him. He put it succinctly, quote, "The world is now reevaluating the role of economic interconnectedness in global affairs, mindful that more interconnection means more dependencies that adversarial nations can leverage to get their way in other areas of international relations. Resilient economies must be the response. In the United States, President Trump's administration is working to de-risk supply chains and build capacity in key industries to enhance economic resilience. This implies a modification of the policy of near unconditional openness that characterized the past. These policies will, in some cases, reduce economic efficiency relative to a world in which we ignore geopolitical risk." Now, I know what you're thinking. This is the Trump administration, hardly a trustworthy source of thinking on this topic. But then, no sooner did I read this piece by Kim Rule when I heard an interview of Chad Bown and Sumaya Keynes, conducted by Paul Krugman, about their book, How to Win a Trade War. And I don't have a quote from this hour-long interview, but the sentiments were almost exactly the same. So this seems to be the new wisdom, that we have to trade off economic efficiency against geopolitical leverage and the risks of interdependence. So I guess my first question for myself and the panel is, has economic interdependence become more of a zero-sum game? Does one side in every transaction gain leverage over the other, and therefore one side's gains are necessarily the other side's loss? Or to put it more concretely, should the United States impose tariffs on imports of toys from China? If so, what's happened to our understanding of comparative advantage? And if not, where do we draw the lines between geopolitical risk and straight-up old-fashioned trade? Second, I'm wondering how many of my colleagues have had their views of the importance of a domestic manufacturing base changed in the last year or two. Is it important that the United States and Europe be able to produce robustly across a range of manufacturing sectors? Leaving aside dual-use goods, for example, is it important that the U.S. and Europe be able to produce electric vehicles, or can we leave that to China? Do we need to be able to produce face masks in preparation for the next pandemic? What is it that we need to be able to produce at home? Third, we used to think trade policy was a second best policy or third best policy in addressing market failures and externalities. We advocated for targeted policies. One could argue, on the one hand, that China used and uses targeted policies, subsidies to promote industries that they feel are important and maybe that they see as creating externalities. And on the other hand, we see China as a big culprit with these subsidies of having disrupted the trading system. So what should be the rules regarding and regulating the use of subsidies in a well-functioning trade system? And is there any role for trade policy in a world with geopolitical risk? Fourth, I guess Ralph is best placed to address this, but any of the others as well. What is the future role of institutions like the WTO in a world of increased geopolitical tensions? Can geopolitical adversaries participate in a rule-based system in a multilateral agreement? And how can an institution or agreement retain its credibility in the absence of any enforcement mechanisms? How should countries that are not global powers, such as those of you who heard Jean Tirole the other night, the zebras of the world, how do they react in a world with geopolitical struggles in the trade realm? Do they have to do they have to choose sides, or is there a realistic middle ground and a way to stay out of the fray? Fifth, if resilience and avoiding dependence and foreign leverage are legitimate aims of trade and industrial policy, how are we, as economists in the future, going to distinguish between legitimate policies and protectionist policies? After all, any sort of trade generates some sort of interdependence and leverage. So where do we draw that line? Is decoupling inevitable and maybe even nationally desirable in a world of adversarial geopolitical relations, or can we preserve some forms of interdependence despite the rivalry? Do we agree with what has become the common wisdom, such as I outlined in the quote, that we've put too much weight on economic efficiency and we've missed the importance of some of these other risks? And finally, again, it seems to be accepted that trade and industrial policies need to respond to geopolitical realities, but it occurs to me that this is a two-way street. It's not clear what's the cause and what's the effect here. We used to think that trade was the way to peace, and trade was closer interdependence and tighter trade relations were the way we avoided geopolitical rivalry. Now we seem to be saying, or some seem to be saying, that we have to avoid trade integration in order to manage these geopolitical rivalries. So how do we think about the interdependence, if you will, between trade and geopolitical tensions? So my framing of the questions hints at some of my answers, but as I said, I will let my esteemed colleagues have the first pass. I'm going to give them each 8 minutes, more or less, which will leave time for some interaction between them. And then if we have time at the end, we can turn to the floor. We'll see how that goes. Okay, we're going to from now on not use the podium, and turn it over to
Okay, thanks so much, Jean. So my plan is to talk about the role of trade policy in combination with other policies for industrial policy. But before doing that, I'd like to talk about what we know or don't know about whether industrial policy works. And I think there are really two distinct questions. The first one is whether industrial policy has any effect at all. So when you give subsidies, protection to firms, do you affect their behavior, or is this just a transfer, money that you're giving to the firm? Here, I think on that front, there's been a boom of credible empirical evidence that industrial policy does affect firms. So Rekha Juhas has some historical work on the Napoleon blockade, and those regions that were protected from UK imports of machinery did grow their manufacturing sector. We have evidence from Nathan Lane about South Korea and the effect of subsidy in the heavy and chemical industry sectors. We have John Van Reenen, subsidies in the United Kingdom being given to different regions working. So we can reject the old skeptical view that this has no effect at all. Now, of course, whether industrial policy works or not, it's not purely about that. It is essentially about whether it's worth it, whether it is a good thing or not to intervene. So the rationale for industrial policy is that you think markets left alone are not going to give you an efficient allocation of resources, that the invisible hand of the market is not equalizing returns to employment, investments across different sectors. There are wedges, and if policy is to succeed, it is because it's reallocating resources towards the low value, from the low to the high value sector. So the previous empirical studies, for all its merits, doesn't shed light on what those wedges are, which are the sectors, the good one, the bad one, what do we know about whether those reallocations were good or bad for the economy as a whole. So in joint work with Andres, we try to focus on the textbook case for industrial policy, where we ask, okay, in a world where it's coming from external economies of scale, what if we try to measure those? What if we try to get empirical estimates of those wedges and then ask, in the best case scenario where the government has done all the work, knows exactly where the distortions are, we're doing the right reallocation, how much are we going to gain? And we found numbers through the lens of our model, it is definitely model dependent, of around a 4% welfare gain in the long run. Just to put things in perspective, the South Korean experience, this is 7% growth of real GDP per capita over a 30-decade period. Our estimates were not even given that in a year. So 4% is definitely nothing to spit at, but it wasn't a miracle either. Now, when you think about geopolitics, how does that change the picture? And it's easy to imagine that semiconductors, rare earth, may have some value because they allow you to influence maybe some foreign rival military action. So there may be a wedge now associated with those geopolitical considerations, but whether industrial policy is going to work or not is going to depend on what you know about those wedges, meaning how much do you value changes in military action abroad, and most importantly, what do we know about the elasticities of those military action to changes in your own industry mix? We don't have these numbers, but if you want to assess whether or not industrial policy works in the age of geopolitics, these are the numbers you will need. Now, coming back to the question of trade policy and whether it has a role to play, the textbook answer, Jean already hinted at that, is no. And for good reason. The idea is that if there are domestic distortions in your economy, you should target them with tools that are correcting that distortion without creating another. And tariffs typically would fail that test. If you think about EVs, for example, there may be reason to subsidize EVs because they are associated with economies of scale. But if you impose an an import tariff on EVs in Europe, you're going to expand production, but you're going to also reduce the consumption by the European consumer. That's a distortion that didn't need to be. In a way, using trade policy here is acupuncture with a fork. It's not the most targeted way to deal with the problem at hand. When thinking about whether geoeconomic considerations affect the traditional answer, I think it may. Interestingly, not because the targeting principle breaks down, it still applies, but because geopolitical considerations may suggest that the target become a foreign target, not a domestic one. If what you're interested in is influencing some foreign rivals' military action, tariff may be the most targeted way to achieve so. If you think about geopolitical sanction, it is pretty intuitive that there may be a more targeted tool than domestic instrument like production subsidies. So that's one example, I think, where you could see trade policy playing a role as part of industrial policy because of geopolitical consideration. I just want to stress, though, that it is not obvious that this would have to be the case. So if you think, for example, that the problem is not you trying to influence the rest of the world, but it's you trying to be resilient, you being worried about foreign influence, the answer would be very different. So if you remember the speech at Davos by Mark Carney about middle powers, the concern here is by being over-invested in trade with a particular country, you may be held up in the future. John McLaren has a fantastic paper from the late 1990s, which is about that precise issue and the rationale for industrial policy that emerges in such circumstances. You can imagine a situation where under laissez-faire, your firms are over-investing. The problem is that they're not taking into account the fact that the foreign rival, once you've specialized in an export sectors, may try to hold you up. And as a government, you may want to step in and avoid that vulnerability. But the way you would do that through the lens of McLaren's analysis is not through tariff. The problem is you're over-specializing in certain sectors, and the best way to avoid that is via production subsidies again. So you are back to a situation where there may be distortion, they may be coming from those new geopolitical considerations, but trade would remain free.
Right on time. Ralph, you're up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jean, for including me on the panel. And I have to say, Anwar, I was very impressed. This was like literally on the second. So I wanted to make it a little bit more concrete and talk about European industrial policy and hopefully in passing answer some of the questions that Jean was posing at the beginning, but I'm sure we can come back to some of them also. And I want to make two basic points. The first point I want to make is that Europe should not imitate Chinese-style interventionism. I think it's important to get the fundamentals right before you turn to industrial policy. And the second point I would want to make is that Europe should not copy US-style unilateralism. I want to hopefully convince you that it's still worthwhile complying with the rules of the WTO. And let me start with an illustrative example that perhaps helps you understand my concern, and that's the example of the German auto industry. So there's a lot of stories you could tell about the German auto industry, also the failure of management and so on. But if you just think about the political environment, I mean, what happened is first the European Union prohibited the comparative advantage technology, essentially, prohibited the internal combustion engine, which is obviously not the best thing for the auto industry. Then the second thing that happened is that Germany was, of course, over-reliant on energy imports, also had an energy transition that was presumably not particularly well managed, and at the end of the day, there were high energy prices. And third, you had an increasing bureaucratic burden that also increased cost. So basically, in some very fundamental ways, I think the business environment for the German auto industry got worse. And then, surprise, surprise, they're really struggling now. Now, you would expect that in the policy discussion now, the emphasis would be on correcting those fundamental issues. And to be fair, there is some discussion also in that direction. But what concerns me is that very quickly now, we go into two particular directions. So one direction is industrial policy. So now there's a big discussion in Europe about buy European, and we need to invest in strategic industries, we need to expand our manufacturing, so fix the problem with industrial policy. And the other angle is basically attack the multilateral trading system. The EU Commissioner is talking about not applying the most favored nation principle so diligently anymore because it's all Chinese import competition that has caused these issues. And let me be clear, I'm not fundamentally against industrial policy. I'm also not denying that there's significant import competition from China that we need to do something about, presumably. I just think you need to make sure that you should not, well, I guess I want to make 2 points. So the first point I want to make is that industrial policy is not a substitute for getting the fundamentals right. So first get the fundamentals right and then think about industrial policy. I guess that should be relatively uncontroversial in this room. But the second point I want to make is a more, I guess, WTO-specific point, which is now engaging in industrial policy, which is potentially incompliant with WTO rules, or even worse, questioning Article 1 of the GATT, which would be the most favored nation rule, I think is dangerous. So let me then explain that second point a little bit more, because you might think, as many politicians think now, that, well, nobody's abiding by the rules anymore. Why should we, why should Europe or any other country for that matter do it differently? And here's where I really want to get, so there's really one number I want to get across, and it's the following. So if you look at the share of world merchandise trade that is conducted directly under the tariffs negotiated at the WTO, so under the MFN tariffs, today, despite all the issues that we're having, it's still 72%. Yeah, so 72% of world trade is conducted under the MFN tariffs of the WTO, and an additional 16% gives tariff reductions that are trade liberalization that's above and beyond these MFN tariffs from preferential trade agreements, which are also compliant with the multilateral trading system. And if you add those numbers up, the conclusion is that only 12% of world merchandise trade currently you can consider being conducted on a power basis. And it's no coincidence that the US share in world merchandise imports is around 14%. Yeah, so the point I want to make is that we all talk about the multilateral trading system being broken. We all talk about unilateralism taking over. We all talk about nobody following the rules anymore. And it's just not true if you look at the world as a whole. And I think it's a dangerous preconception. It can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is why I think we also shouldn't engage in industrial policy now, for example, that is incompliant or that risks further undermining the rules. I'm looking at the time now. I want to be as good as Arno. So very quickly then, so what does this all mean for China? Does this mean that we shouldn't deal with industrial policy? And here I just want to say two things briefly. So the first point I want to make is big picture. Clearly, China, the Chinese recent story has been a success story. It's incredible how much they grew. The amount of poverty alleviation and so on has been truly remarkable. And of course, there's a lot of industrial policy in China, so it's easy to conclude that somehow industrial policy made this work. I mean, my reading of the situation is a little bit different. I think they started from very far inside the production possibilities frontier, then moved away from government intervention, got a little bit closer to the production's possibilities frontier, but I would say they're doing well despite industrial policy and not because of industrial policy. They're doing well because they're doing less industrial policy now than they used to. So I don't think it's a model to emulate. That's the first point I want to make. Second point I want to make about China is that, of course, the industrial policy that is conducted there does impose externalities on other countries, and I also wouldn't be so naive to say, well, let's just let this happen. And I think, I would propose two things. So the first one is actually something Jean and Alan Sykes proposed in a paper last year, which is perhaps in the short run, some sort of managed trade arrangement in critical sectors in order to buffer some of the impacts of these industrial policies. And what I mean by managed trade is basically some sort of quantity restrictions here. And the second thing is you just need reform of the WTO's agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. It's not that China is not following the rules. I think by most accounts, they're following the rules as much or little as many other countries. It's just that the rules are not particularly well designed for those for the specific circumstances of this country. So clearly some reform is needed, and hopefully we'll get there at some point. But the main point I want to get across is that the system still works pretty well, and we should try to preserve it as much as we can. Thank you.
Very good. Andres.
Well, thank you very much for including me in this panel. I think the topic is very timely. I think it is extremely important and interesting conceptually to think about how the current geopolitical environment and the new geopolitical rivalries are changing or should be changing the way we're thinking about industrial policy. Traditionally, industrial policy has been justified by domestic market failures. So those are the wedges that Arnaud was talking about. And I've been thinking about industrial policy for a long time. I find myself now very engaged and interested in the new questions that are arising around geoeconomics or geopolitical rivalry, about how to modify our thinking or extend our thinking about industrial policy. As a human being, I am very concerned about the rising geopolitical rivalry and what it implies for fragmentation, trade policy, industrial policy, etc. As an economist, I'm fascinated by the challenges and the kind of new questions that emerge. So governments are increasingly concerned about supply chain vulnerabilities and the ability of foreign powers to use economic relationships as instruments of coercion. This is a theme that goes back to Hirschman's famous paper in the 1940s and his study of national power and the structure of foreign trade. These concerns have become particularly salient around semiconductors, critical mineral, batteries, telecommunications equipment, and other sectors viewed as strategically important. One way to incorporate them is to expand the objective function of government so that instead of the traditional view, which is industrial policy is about maximizing welfare, taking into account domestic distortions, now we're actually trying to maximize some broader or extended objective that includes something like national security. This is an old idea in economics of non-economic objectives guiding public policy. Another is to model geoeconomics as a strategic interaction in which countries use the threat of sanctions, export controls, and other instruments to influence each other's behavior. Either way, whether by admitting non-economic objectives or by expanding the toolbox beyond taxes to threats of taxes contingent on foreign behavior, geoeconomics provides a rationale for interventions that would be hard to justify in the traditional view of industrial policy. Now, once we accept that resilience and security matter, a difficult question arises. Resilience against what? Dependence on whom and at what cost? This is where economic analysis still has much work to do. It is easy to say that countries should become more resilient, broad-based it is easy to say that countries should become more resilient. It is much harder to say which vulnerabilities matter most and how much a society should be willing to sacrifice economic welfare to reduce those vulnerabilities. A second point concerns the dynamics of dependence, and it tells us which dependencies are the costly ones. Under comparative advantage, dependence is a position you walk back. Cut imports, reallocate along an unchanged frontier, and return to autarky at the productivity you would always have had. The loss is real, but it is recoverable. Under dynamic increasing returns, however, dependence is like a hole you have to climb out of. Having stopped producing, you slid down the learning curve, and relocating factors is necessary but no longer sufficient because the technology itself has regressed. So the costly dependencies are the ones exhibiting hysteresis, and this is also why they are the coercive ones, since a threat has bite only where recovery is slow. And as you think about this, there was a recent paper, a recent article in the New York Times talking about the emerging dominance of China in batteries. And as you read that article, you could see exactly this kind of analysis playing out and how the US, in that article in particular, is thinking about the threat of future coercive threats coming from a dominant supplier of a critical input to not only EVs, but the energy infrastructure of a country. Beyond fine-tuning of industrial policy to an expanded set of objectives, we should also think about the broader effects of many countries pursuing those objectives at once. Geopolitical rivalry erodes trust, leading countries to reduce dependence, which in turn reduces specialization and trade. The emergence of a multipolar world and the US stepping back from its traditional role as guarantor of the global economic order will likely bring some fragmentation and, unfortunately, lower gains from trade. However, there is still room for cooperation to avoid the most damaging outcomes, and I want to spend my remaining time on where that room is. First, the hegemons themselves may want international institutions that constrain their own actions. This is a point nicely emphasized in a recent work by Clayton, Majori, and Schreger. Countries that anticipate coercion will invest in alternatives and reduce dependence, which erodes the hegemon's power in the first place. Anticipating this, the hegemon may prefer to commit not to abuse its leverage, and international agreements are ones to make that commitment credible. This parallels the commitment theory of trade agreements, where agreements allowed governments to tie their hands against domestic pressures from lobbies and investors, except that here the commitment is for powerful countries not to use their control over choke points to extract geopolitical and economic concessions from others. Second, countries should coordinate to reduce dependence jointly. For a single small country, building an alternative to a dominant world supplier of a critical input is simply too expensive to be worthwhile. But the cost of standing up an alternative source is largely a fixed cost, and it can be shared. A coalition of importers that jointly finances and commits to an alternative supplier spreads that cost while each member gains from lower exposure to a single dominant source. Because all participants benefit from the same reduction in vulnerability, the incentives here seem reasonably well aligned. This is the logic behind arrangements like the Mineral Security Partnership in the EU. And the main challenge is coordination rather than a deep conflict of interest. Finally, these efforts to adapt the WTO to an era of sharper rivalry are far more likely to succeed if they stay focused on border measures and on domestic measures with a domestic focus rather than on extraterritorial ones. A country is entitled to set the terms of its own market through investment screening, procurement, or subsidies, and resilience can largely be pursued within that space. This is precisely the latitude that shallow integration was designed to protect. The danger comes when measures reach across the border to govern how production is conducted inside the rival's economy. Such extraterritorial measures do not preserve market access. They reach into the structure of production itself, they shift the rival's best response, and individually rational steps then compound into mutual escalation and fragmentation. Keeping cooperation shallow is what makes it sustainable under rivalry. Let me close with a broader point. The return of geopolitics does not eliminate the case for cooperation. If anything, it raises the value of rules that let countries pursue legitimate security objectives without sliding into a geoeconomic arms race. The lesson is not to abandon the industrial policy, nor to embrace it indiscriminately, but to discipline it. Intervene where it genuinely matters, at the key choke points where the geoeconomic benefits outweigh the economic costs. Use domestic instruments and preserve market access. The same logic that once justified trade agreements, preventing individually rational actions from producing collectively undesirable outcomes, now extends to the geoeconomic sphere. The role of the WTO going forward is not to adjudicate every deep question of standards, subsidies, and supply chains, but to preserve the one thing it does uniquely well, a credible, non-discriminatory balance of market access, so that the more rivalrous world does not become a reason to dismantle the very system that produced the gains from integration in the first place. Thanks.
So thank you very much also for letting me to participate in this panel. And in fact, it's very difficult to add after basically the topics that actually the three of them cover. I have to say that you started basically the discussion talking about Kim's rules basically statement. I was 2 weeks ago also on a conference organized by Yale. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership Conference, in which we had policymakers, academics, and also journalists from Europe and the US. And I think one consensus on the conference across people was that industrial policy has become unavoidable in a geopolitical environment. But industrial policy, while might be necessary, it must be disciplined. One might actually try to identify what are the market failures to potentially come and, and potentially intervene. Industrial policy simply choosing strategic sectors only on the sake because you think it's a strategic sector can deal to unintended consequences, and in particular, losses of resources. So that's kind of something to keep in mind, that I think the simple idea that we should use industrial policy only for the sake of it, I think it's potentially a big mistake. So for example, think about electric vehicles. You might actually think that the industry of electric vehicles, it's an industry that you want your country to participate, but it's not simply subsidizing that industry the way you actually would create it. Identify what are the distortions. Why is it that you can actually not have electrical vehicles in your country? Maybe it's the fact that you don't have the engineers today in place to produce those vehicles. Maybe you don't have access to the particular materials that you need to basically get access to that particular industry. So I should try to identify what are the market failures that don't allow you to potentially create that industrial base. That's one point I wanted to make. The second point I want to make, I think the real challenge, okay, and of course, you were talking about tariffs. Tariff is clearly not a solution to basically deal with industrial policy. It's a very bad instrument to use tariffs to potentially help your industrial base. So let me go back to a different related topic, which is, I remember in the 70s, very Latin American countries were conducting industrial policy. In Brazil, in Chile, nationalizing their own domestic industries. And that was a big backlash from the rest of the world, from the IMF, the World Bank, and the United States against these countries from the fact that they were basically conducting those industrial policy. And today we live in a very different world, because today we're seeing countries, again, like Europe and the United States, and of course China, conducting and basically thinking about conducting industrial policy. The challenge that I see forward is how do we move and integrate countries, not force countries to follow your particular model, but how do we integrate countries with very different domestic policies? I don't think the model that we used in the past, which is, okay, we should all focus on efficiency. Yes, we should all focus on efficiency, but once you add geopolitical considerations, it's going to be a trade-off. How much of efficiency are you willing to give up for those geopolitical considerations? Now, each country might have their own trade-offs and might decide how much to give up in terms of efficiency. Efficiency, I mean the allocations of resources and the best use that you have in each country. So how much are you willing to give up? That's a national consideration, domestic consideration. The international consideration that I see and challenging is how do we integrate economies in the world with very different domestic policies. And there, Ralph was making sense, basically providing one way to do that. Maybe, I'm not sure, that's I think a question that I don't know the answer, maybe tariff might be a way to do this. I hope not, because what we do know, and this is related to the topic that we were discussing yesterday, that and related to the presidential address, aggregate trade and openness and globalization has been very good for all countries in the world. So that's kind of what I see the challenge for, is how do we going to basically move forward in a world in which each country, we can let them have their domestic policies, do whatever they want, to deal with different, national considerations, in a world that we can actually integrate these countries with different structures.
Okay, let me pose some questions and get some discussion going if I can. So the one thing I heard all of you say was that geopolitical objectives are a legitimate, non-economic addition to overall welfare, inclusive welfare, and that policies that pursue that are also legitimate. So how do we write international rules in such a, how do we know when a country is doing things for legitimate reasons and when it's illegitimate? What do we mean by legitimate then, if we're willing to admit anything? It's like, if you can't question someone's preferences, then how can you question their behavior? For anybody?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I think even without geopolitical consideration, it's a hard question of what's a protectionist versus a legitimate motive. If you think about product standards or environmental standards, there may be a legitimate objective here of protecting public health. When you prohibit the import of a particular species of pigs that happen to be produced by the antibiotic that only your main exporter was using, maybe there is more to it than just a legitimate objective. I feel in the case of standards, it's a difficult issue, hormone growth beef, the EU versus the United States, but we've been able to navigate. There are egregious cases that you can spot. I would imagine that with geopolitical consideration, there would be some of that when Canada worries, it resonates, and maybe there are things they could do, and there are things that would be obviously protectionist. But yeah, it was a hard issue, and maybe it's just become a little harder.
I mean, if I may, I would just revert to the basic framework of not questioning government's preferences, but thinking about the externalities they impose on other countries, and then trying to find a solution in governmental bargaining to that. But of course, you have particularly difficult questions surrounding national security. At the WTO now, there's basically a blanket exemption for national security motives, and of course that can be abused to undermine the whole system. And I think there you also, you also just need the willingness of countries to cooperate. But if I may, could I say just make one additional point, because I thought so many great points were made, and it was hard to disagree with anything. So at least I wanted to disagree with Kim Rule on one point. And one thing that bothers me in this whole discussion is that people always say, well, yes, there are legitimate motives to worry about leverage, worry about strategic dependence, interdependence, and so on. And then the conclusion is we need to do something now to make things ourselves because we can't trust the trading partner. And I think that's the step that doesn't make any sense, really. I mean, I understand that you don't want to be coerced by another country into doing what you don't want to do. But I think one obvious way out is to diversify. So trade basically is a solution to the problem and not just the source to the problem. I think that's the first thing. And the second thing we have completely forgotten, and you mentioned that in your introduction, Jean, is this whole point of interdependence, right? I mean, imagine Germany is importing rare earths now and is dependent on them, sure. And now what they're doing is they're digging for rare earths somewhere in northern Germany. It doesn't make any sense, I think, because there's a reason why Germany is importing rare earths. It's not the country's comparative advantage. So I think one could rethink the whole discussion, and instead of trying to become independent, why aren't countries investing in their strengths and trying to generate a balance of power that gives them leverage also over their trading partner? And I'm not saying that this is something that would be the laissez-faire equilibrium, but if I were to use industrial policy, I wouldn't use it to make myself independent from you. I would use it to make you just as dependent on me as I'm dependent on you. So I can basically use that leverage afterwards. And then you would basically invest in your strengths and not your weaknesses. I think that
What
would
if you
make more
happen to
sense.
have comparative advantage in goods that are not that important for security or for, survival, and you're trading those goods for rare earths, which seem to be important for everything?
Sure. I mean, I'm not...
Say tourism and luxury goods as an example.
Well, luxury goods, I would argue, I mean, if the dictator can't have their Maybach, I think it's probably a very effective tool.
I think this is consistent with what Ralph and Arnaud have said, but let me just frame it in this way. I would say the idea that governments are going to have these extended objectives that go beyond welfare and including particular national security, doesn't give a blanket excuse for governments to impose tariffs. And I think the two approaches here, which would be complementary, are on the one hand, some kind of regulation, and on the other hand, some kind of compensation. So the regulation is, well, you can't just say this is national security that you're not going to import solar panels or dryers or TVs. There has to be, and so there would be some, and I don't know to what extent this is already codified in the WTO. So Ralph, I would be interested in knowing more about this, but presumably there is a way to make sure that countries are not just saying that anything they do is because of national security. And the other one is, to the extent that this leads to an improvement in a country's terms of trade, you're importing less from another country, which is then affected in terms of trade, then there would be some compensation, so that you're increasing market access for something else, so that you are you are compensating the country. And Arnaud has actually written a recent paper where you're kind of getting into these kinds of things of how do you extend market access in a setting where you now care about things that go beyond traditional market goods, like environmental externalities and geoeconomics. So these are things I think that we need to think about, but I would say kind of regulation and compensation are the ways to approach this problem.
Yeah, I won't add much to this. So one thing that actually happened in the last years was, I mean, the idea of moving towards and going back to the idea of efficiency, let countries try to specialize in what they have comparative advantages. As a result, that actually increased interdependence in a way. We created global value change. So now countries are related in many much deeper way compared to the past. But it also created sectors which clearly had a comparative advantage, like semiconductors, producing in one part of the world. And that is a challenge moving forward in a world in which suddenly you want to diversify. So semiconductors, you might think you would like to diversify in that particular sector. You don't want to have a bottleneck in semiconductors. It's equally or even more important to them than oil, and what's going on with these oil shocks. So it's a challenge. So it's a challenge how to make sectors that take time to specialize, to diversify in those sectors. I don't see what type of policies can actually be able to achieve that. Maybe what we're moving on forward basically might force countries to think about industrial policy to actually generate this diversification, but it's going to come at the expense of more expensive semiconductors. And related to your point, to your question more directly, Jean, is how to make sure that countries are obeying particular rules that we impose. It's a very difficult question. I think it's a very difficult question, and that's, I think, the task of the future of WTO. How do we create rules to make sure that we actually follow and obey in a particular rule? And so I don't know the answer to that.
want to come back to the question I posed. Have any of your opinions of the importance of a manufacturing base changed over the last year and a half? We used to say, preach that if you have comparative advantage in services, you import the goods, you export the services. Now I'm hearing an increasing number of colleagues say, of course we have to have a manufacturing base. It's important for national security, for our self-esteem, for I don't know what the reasons are. I'm not buying them, but I'm wondering if any of you have fallen into this trap.
Well, I used to think now in all the policy discussions at the WTO, I used to be very strong saying, you know, manufacturing doesn't really matter, and also trade imbalances don't matter, until at some point I remembered that I have a paper, my job market paper, where it's all about basically using tariffs to increase the domestic manufacturing activity, and that manufacturing trade imbalance is actually a vicious statistic for how this all works. So then I had to backtrack a little bit. But now I would just see it more broadly. I mean, you have a model, I think, that makes that point more broadly, where you just say, you know, if you have a bunch of sectors and these sectors have different external increasing returns, or whatever the source of the inefficiency is, then of course there may be a reason to prop up one over the other, but I wouldn't say it's generally manufacturing over others. I mean, think about AI or something like that. I mean, nobody would call that manufacturing. Clearly, it's of strategic importance.
I think one thing I would also want to add to these discussions about resilience is that maybe it's annoying, but it is really subtle. So the fact, for example, that the probability of going to war in the future with a geopolitical rival has gone up, that in itself is not a rationale for policy intervention. From the point of view of your country, I mean, you wish it didn't happen, but this is like a negative productivity shock. Those things are right, and first welfare theorem would say still do nothing. You're not as good as before, but it's not a rationale for policy intervention. What we're discussing, when we're discussing, for example, the work of McLaren, this is something that's much more subtle than that. This is, I may be held up by my foreign rival, and my firms don't understand that out of the equilibrium path, there is something like that threatens me, and that's the rationale for policy intervention. So you know, there are cases one can make, but they're subtle, and we have to remember that.
I was just going back to the more broad question of the manufacturing sector. Clearly, the recipe of you should have a strong manufacturing sector for development. That's not something that would apply to all countries. Caribbean islands that rely on tourism surely should not be thinking in those terms. It's not a new idea, obviously. I mean, this is something that people have been saying for a long time. It was a big part of the industrial policy and trade policy in Latin America and other developing countries in the 50s and 60s. And I would say, yes, there are people that have that conviction. I think it has actually softened a bit to apply to other tradable goods. Sophisticated agriculture, services, like Ralph was saying, have a lot of room for sophistication, learning. And so to the extent that there are these dynamic externalities in other sectors, there is no reason necessarily to favor manufacturing. And I've been curious and open to seeing evidence that manufacturing is special in that regard relative to other sectors, and I have never seen something that convinces me that that's the case.
Okay, so.
And I tend to agree. I mean, the idea of simply saying that the only way to grow is with manufacturing, I think it's potentially falsifying the data. The only case that I can see in manufacturing is potentially if you have an industry like the military industry. Maybe you want to have all your intermediate goods produced in the military industry to do in-house, potentially on a threat of a war or something like this. But besides that particular industry, I don't see. And the world has changed substantially. I mean, the value added today created in services and new sub-industries are substantial compared to the old school of what actually was manufactured. Today, manufacturing, in a way, it's sliced across countries. It's going back to my point about this global value chain. There's not a sense in which cars can be produced only in one country. different parts of the cars are going to be produced in different countries. So that's kind of my point. There's another discussion that I know it's not related direct to the question, which is with this new technological revolution that we're seeing, which is AI. And I think this is going to bring, as it did before information technology, new occupations, new ways to produce that we haven't produced before. So maybe we're lucky, maybe the world is lucky that with this technological shock in the future, we're going to sidestep all these issues. I hope so. But I don't think that a way moving forward is to potentially only focus on manufacturing. Let manufacturing be produced in the countries that have more cost-efficient ways to produce, and not simply say only on the fact that if you don't produce planes, you won't be able to succeed. I'll give you an example. Tourism, more than 10% of the population in the world works on tourism. For some countries, it's a big revenue. In fact, the US doesn't realize, but in terms of tourism, it has a surplus, not a deficit. But all the policies that the US actually created, the increase in the price of oil, tariffs, and migration policies have made that sector now worst. So there's many sectors that countries should specialize, focus on their competitive advantage.
I don't know, has the probability of conflict gone up exogenously, or have our failure to get along on the trade side contributed to that tension?
Yeah, that's interesting. I agree with your observation at the beginning about the two-way causation between the two, and the fact that trade may also have a role to play in promoting peace. When you think about the European project, that's the idea. That's worked quite well.
Okay, I will take responsibility for the fact that we had too much agreement on this panel. I formed the panel with friends whose opinion I respect, which means close to mine, and so there we are. I see the clock ticking away. I know that the organizers want to keep us on schedules, and there's another panel to follow, so why don't we draw to a close here. Thank you for your attention.